tester.co.uk.
Hello YouTubers, and welcome to this part 3 of how to solar power your home. Now, you'll have seen me rubbing that solar panel, and why would I be doing that? So just as an indication, as a lead into what we're doing in this video, which is talking about sizing your solar power system. Dirt on a solar panel can mean that you lose up to anywhere between 2 to 15% of your power output on a solar panel for your solar system. Those kinds of calculations are critical in understanding what power or what energy you're going to get out of your solar system. So let's talk about the different ways people might size their solar power systems and the potential losses that you need to cater for when doing those calculations. So we're going to go through that and get down onto the bench and have a look at those calculations, but I kind of want to walk you through some of those potential losses just so that you've got an understanding, because if I get down onto the bench and say, right, we need to cater for 30% in power loss from your solar array, people might go, what? Why on earth? But there are a fair few things which contribute to that. So as I said, for something like dirt, your wiring, heat on a solar panel means it produces less power. To put that into perspective, our solar array on our house, which is a 2250 watt solar array, I know that on a reasonably coolish day in spring, at peak time at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it will produce about 2200 to 2300 watts. However, today, now we're in nice peak summer, it will only produce 1600 to 1700 watts. That's a loss of anywhere between 20 to 30%. Then there's, if you're using batteries, there's potentially another 30% in energy you're going to lose by just trying to put your energy into a battery and take it back out. Why is that? There's internal resistance in a battery. And if you picture your hand, rubbing your hand hard on a carpet, that's the same as energy going into a battery. And the faster you rub your hand on the carpet, the potentially hotter and sore your hand is going to get. It's the same for putting energy into a battery. There are going to be more losses the faster you try and put energy into a battery and take it out. And those have to be accounted for. Now, following on from this video, we are going to kind of look at the individual components, in particular new technologies like what's happening in solar power panels and in battery or energy storage, because there are perhaps better technologies or better battery technologies than plain lead acid or even lead crystal. We could talk about lithium and new technology in capacitors, but that'll come in subsequent videos. Now then, in terms of sizing an array, the one is to kind of take your power consumption that we worked out in the previous video and saying, right, how do I calculate if I want to obtain that energy from the sun, what size of solar system do I need to produce that? And that's what we're going to go and calculate. The other is, if you're the kind of person who doesn't need a battery storage system, which it costs a lot of money and is very wasteful, but if you're off the grid, you have to have an energy storage system. If you run a hybrid system like we do here in South Africa, because we cannot feed energy back onto the grid, so we cannot gain credit or money for producing energy we put back onto the grid, there's a caveat to that. You can put it back, but our energy company doesn't really reward you for that. So then your only way of milking your investment in your solar panels is to then store it in a battery bank or energy storage system and use that energy later on, let's say at night. So then those calculations become important, and you kind of want to understand what you're going to gain and what your losses are. Then those perhaps fortunate who are based in either the States or parts of Europe or the UK, you may be able to feed back into the grid. You don't need an energy storage system because you're gaining credit for everything you're producing during the day. They're probably the most critical item that's going to judge the size of your system is the size of your wallet. It's how much money you can spend on that array, because you may as well then invest as much as you can, because you're putting that straight back and earning credit for it. But of course, you may want to understand how much production am I going to get from a certain size array, so I can understand how much potentially I'm going to feed back onto the grid or feed my house, so that I understand how much I'll earn back in money. And again, that's where the calculations are really helpful. So taking note of that, let's pop onto the bench and start looking at those calculations so we start getting an idea. Right, so what I want to do is a very quick recap, and if you haven't seen the previous videos in this series, I suggest you do, because then it all kind of hangs together and makes sense. But in the previous exercise, we went and kind of made our home more efficient in terms of its energy usage and consumption, so that we could come up with a better figure ready to solar power our home. So we came up, after our kind of changing of appliances and what have you, we came down to a figure of 8.2 kilowatt hours. And that's what we're going to base our calculations from to run our home. So we want to size a system which will run our home of about 8.2 kilowatt hours. Now then, so let's start talking about those items that I did mention earlier, the losses, because they are important and can play a big part. And what I want to highlight is that sizing a solar power system is not an exact science, because when you realize that you've got to cater for things like heat, dirt, loss in your wiring, the efficiencies of the inverters, you can to a certain extent read the kind of nameplate rating or efficiency of an inverter, but that might be under ideal conditions. You don't know how much dirt accumulation you're going to have in your solar panels, or potentially what kind of weather conditions or how heat is going to affect your system. So there certainly isn't exact science, but it certainly gives you a relatively good idea. But you just have to appreciate that there are these variables, and that's what I want to make you aware of when sizing a system and how these can affect the performance of your solar power and your solar power production. Right, so the first thing to note, and these are items that we'll pick up on when we kind of look at the individual components in the next video, is that your PV or your solar panel, the manufacturer, hopefully if it's a reasonably good manufacturer, will have a data sheet or a power tolerance on that data sheet. Now on a solar panel, even though it may be rated at 250 watts, when they produce it, there can be certain issues with the quality of the way it's been put together, or the glass. There are a whole lot of items, and they have to test it. And they potentially, depending on how good the manufacture process is, they will rate the power tolerance or output that you're going to get from that panel. It could be as bad as less 10%, or you could have a gain of 10%. If you've got a really good manufacturer, what you hope to see is that they have a rating of this, minus 0% versus plus, let's say, 3% or 5%, because they don't want to give you a solar panel that's going to produce less power than they're actually rating it for. So this is something to be very wary of. And in that regard, so these are the losses on this side, and I'm taking perhaps an average on this side to build up a calculation for our losses. So I'm going to say that potentially our manufacturer has got a minus 2%. Now obviously these are losses, so they're not negative, they're already losses. So I'm saying we potentially got a 2% loss on our solar panel. Then potentially from heat, you can have up to 10% on average loss from a solar panel once it's installed. As I said, on mine, at the peak part of the day, I can lose anywhere up to 30% of my solar panel power production. Now obviously you're not going to have that loss at the beginning of the day, because they're going to be cool hopefully, and at the end of the day. And again, this depends very much where you live in the world. If it's fairly cool and you've got snow and they're not covered with snow, you can see power production in excess of 30% plus on a solar panel. But this is something we need to take into account. So for me living here in Cape Town, I'm putting down an average loss of about 10%. Dirt, as I said, you can potentially have dirt build up on your panels, depending on how they're mounted. If they're mounted flat, in the case of my home in Tambers Kloof that we sold, I did mount the solar panels flat. Why? Because we had neighbors behind and I didn't want to offend them by having them up on, it was a flat roof and I couldn't have them up on a rack. So there, potentially you're going to get pooling of water and your panels are going to get far dirtier. But here I've gone for a loss of 5%. Coming back to, again, I want to mention something about heat on a solar panel, and it's again something we'll pick up. If your panels are mounted flat on a roof, an angled roof, with let's say black shingles, that again can have a huge contribution to heat buildup. If you have a flat roof and you have a mounting system which gives you air behind your panels like I do, that again can help. Wiring, particularly DC wiring, you can expect a loss of anywhere between 2%, which is good, to 10% plus. Now I'm going to have a separate video covering this because this potentially is an important topic. Not only loss in your wiring, but if your connectors on your wiring are not crimped on properly, you can have extra losses. The switch gear, the fusing, all contribute. So here I'm going to take a reasonably conservative loss of only 3%. Then we get your inverter charger. So in my case, I've got both a grid tie and an inverter charger. And on both of those, I'm saying, right, you can have anywhere between, if you get a good grid inverter with good efficiency, it might have 94, 95, 96%. So you can have 2 to 15% loss. Now I've got two of those, so I'm going to average that out in this calculation at about 7%. Now, batteries, as I said, putting energy into batteries and taking it out, you can easily incur a 30% loss. So those of you who only have pure grid-tied systems and don't have to worry about batteries in terms of calculations, well then you only have to cater for, let's say, up to this point. So if we go and add up these losses, we're already looking at, and this is excluding the batteries, 27% just due to some losses. And there could potentially be all kinds of other factors which make this worse. You could have a solar installer who doesn't install things properly, doesn't angle the panels correctly, doesn't do the wiring correctly. The glass itself, there's something we haven't catered for, has a reflective value. So if you've got your sunlight coming directly onto your solar panel, because that's how they test it in the factory, then that's the most ideal situation. But as soon as you've got an angle of incidence, the glass potentially could have a reflective quality which also incurs losses. So that's something potentially that can also affect your power production. But if we have to cater for your batteries of 30%, now what I'm doing here, I'm not purely adding the batteries in our calculation. If you did include those losses due to batteries, you're looking at potentially 57% in losses. In our system, because we've got a combination of a grid tie which directly feeds the house for part of the time, and then part of that energy also goes into the batteries and incurs losses, I'm splitting the difference. And I'm saying that on average for a hybrid system, or particularly let's say my system, I could have to cater for losses up to 40%. But this hopefully just makes you realize the potential bits and pieces you need to consider when actually sizing what you're going to get out of your system. Right, so now let's get down to understanding if we want to produce, as I said from that previous exercise, we worked out that our house consumes 8.2 kilowatt hours in a 24-hour period, or 8,200 watt hours. How do we do the calculation to size our solar system? Well, we've already worked out we've got potentially 40% in losses, so we need to add a potential 40% onto that, because if we need that net power out. So once you do that, you add the 40%, we're already up to 11,480 watt hours. Now you'll see in the calculations, for me, when I get these kind of figures, I tend to round up, obviously because of the losses, to get it to a better figure. Then there's another important fact, which is obviously location based, and that's understanding how much sunshine you get. Now I will on my website, on my forum, have links to this information in terms of the calculations and in terms of solar radiation. So there are solar radiation maps for around the world where calculations have been done to give you a rough idea of the average peak hours per year. So as you can see, I'm using a figure of 5. I actually think, if I remember correctly, the figure for Cape Town is 5.5 hours per day of peak sunlight time. And again, that's an average. So obviously during winter it's going to be less. During summer you're going to have a longer day. But obviously at the start of the day you have less power production. At the end of the day you have less. So this is what they work it down to. An average of peak sunlight production hours. So you can then multiply that to get the size of your array. We can say, fine, we need to produce, and I'm rounding up slightly over here, 11,500 watt hours. We've got 5 hours to do that in. So if we divide that by 5, we then come down to the rough size of our array. 2,300 watts is the size of our array. And again, obviously, if you're working that backwards, if you've got an array that size and you're producing that power for 5 hours, then you get back to your energy production in kilowatt hours or watt hours. Right, so now we understand that we think we need an array of 2,300 watts. I'll give you an example just of figures of my array, which happens to be around 2,250 watts. On a bad day, on an overcast day or a rainy day, I will see production figures of around 4 kilowatt hours in a day. And on a good day, when it's nice and sunny, I will see 13.5 kilowatt hours. And if you do the mean of that, the average of that certainly sits around the kind of 8 watt hours, or 8 kilowatt hours I should say. This wasn't by design. I didn't do these calculations around my system, but it just happens to give a fairly good idea of how this works out. Now, something I want to highlight here again in terms of heat, when we installed our system in spring, it was producing around 13 kilowatt hours in a day. And I thought, and I noted this in the video, that I should be producing about 16 kilowatt hours at the peak of summer, because the day we were going to have at least 2 to 3 hours of extra sunlight. But lo and behold, in peak summer, we're still only producing this time because of that knockdown due to heat. So we have more hours of production, but in the peak part of the day we get less production because of the heat, losing literally about 20 to 30% during the peak part of our day. Right, so then what about your actual, now that we know the size of the array, the next items are, let's say, the grid tie inverter. Now, this again isn't an exact science. There are potentially, depending on the type of grid tie inverter that you select, there are different factors. But let's say for this system, as a rough guess, I would always add 30% onto your array. So in this case, if we took the array size, which we've obviously calculated at 2,300 watts, add 30%, you're looking at a requirement of about 2,990 watts for your grid tie inverter. Now, why 30%? Because potentially you might want to increase the size of your array later on, and you don't want to have to go and change equipment. That might be one logic for choosing this figure. Also, my array on a cold, crisp day will produce sustained 2,300 to 2,500 watts, and I've seen it peak at 3,000 watts. So you certainly want to make sure that your grid tie can cater for that. There's another interesting logic here which we'll kind of look into to take into account, is that you may realize that you still want this power production on a rainy day. So you're going to have to increase the size of your array, but you don't want to outlay on the grid tie. And some grid ties will cater for a big array, but will only allow you to produce this figure. So what you're doing, you're building a bigger solar array, but you're writing that off in good weather because you know you want to produce a certain figure. But again, those items we'll cover off in later videos. But for this exercise, for this kind of household and production, about a 3000 watt inverter seems like a good idea. Then we get down to the inverter charger. So as you know, on the system we're building here, I have a grid tie which brings in the power from the solar panels. That can be fed directly into the house because it goes from DC to AC. But then I also need to store the extra power in batteries, or the extra energy in batteries, so that I can use it in the evening. And here, to size your inverter charger, you need to understand the most important thing to note there is your peak power usage. And that you'll only know by using measuring equipment. So you may, in your house, have something which switches on like a fridge or a motor, which requires a large, for one, you have to understand startup power. You want to know that your inverter can handle a peak power for a certain time. So here in this example, I have an inverter that's rated at 500 VA, so that's volts amps, but for 4500 watts. Now here, this is where you've got to take power factor into account. So let's call it a 4500 watt inverter. It does cater for a short duration peak load of 10,000 watts. Now when does that happen? When your fridge starts, your fridge may run at 500 watts, but when it starts up, it needs 1500 watts because the motor is inductive. So you need to make sure that your inverter can cater for those. But ultimately, for sustained loads, you need to know what your household uses. Now here in South Africa, on the whole, for most family homes, a 6000 watt inverter catering for peak load should be enough. I used another logic for my Kloof home. I bought a 4000 watt inverter. I went for that for financial reasons. That's what I could afford. Also, the 6000 watt inverter was a lot bigger and bulkier, and where I wanted to place it was going to be difficult. So I adopted the approach, and this is perhaps a healthy approach to adopt, that I would buy the 4000 watt inverter, and that would curb my power usage. I would still aim to reduce my footprint in terms of power consumption, and that's another healthy way to look at things. But nonetheless, so we have this inverter here, and it is rated as a 50 amp battery charger. It happens to be a 48 volt system. Now before we get down to the batteries, we're going to have a look at another calculation. Obviously what I haven't spoken about here is using an MPPT charge controller where you don't use grid tie. Now there, something like a FlexMax 60 or FlexMax 80 should cater for an array of this size. As you heard me mention previously, generally speaking, a MPPT charge controller in this situation is perhaps not the best or most efficient system, but there are instances where a charge controller might be better than having a grid tie inverter. And that's thanks to a conversation I had with someone who emailed me, and it took a bit of thinking, but we are going to cover that off in the next video as well, whether you choose to go a grid tie inverter on your system or a charge controller. Right, so let's get down to sizing the battery bank. Now, from our previous exercise, the one thing you might want to go through is, obviously, if you're storing energy in a battery bank, obviously you're potentially going to use that battery bank at night. So you want to size that battery bank for your evening consumption. So what I've done here, I've taken the items which I would consider are using power at night, like your fridge, your TV, your lights. The heat pump, I'm assuming that you've obviously heated the water up during the day. The pool pump shouldn't be running at night, hopefully, and you don't want to if you're going to be using a system like that. And obviously you're going to be using your microwave oven. So, taking that into account, our fridge was using, over a 24-hour period, 1,392 watt hours. If we say that 50% of that is happening at night time, well, that brings us down to 696 watt hours. Our television, let's assume we're nighttime television viewers, so that all of that then, that 125 watt hours we need to cater for. We've got lights, and obviously we're using lights at night. I say obviously, If you're a business, a factory, you may be using your lights during the day, so that's something to consider. But here in this house, we're using our lights at night, so that's another 350 watt hour. And our microwave, we're going to cook for ourselves, that's 600 watt hour. Now, as you'll realize, this is a very basic home. I've not catered for things like cell phone chargers or passive power users which might be running during the night, and those you need to take into account. But here for our basic setup, that gives us a total of 1,771 watt hour that we potentially want to have an energy source for at night. So, just as a rough guide, normally you know that your batteries are rated in amp hour, but for these calculations, amp hour isn't the most useful, so what I like to do is to convert that to watt hour. And again, I'll state it, that even though you have an amp hour rating on a battery of, let's say, 150 amp hour, to get 150 amp hour out of a battery means you're going to damage it very quickly. Hence my exercise of understanding the robustness of lead crystal batteries. But nonetheless, you don't really want to cycle your batteries more than down to 50% depth of charge. And in fact, you don't want to go if you want to extend the life, you don't want to go lower than kind of 60 or even 70%. But let's work on 50. So that means we've got 75 amp hour. And if you go 12 times 75, that is going to give us 900 watt hours from a battery. And in my case, I have lead crystal batteries rated at 12 volt, 150 amp hour. It's a rough estimation. So in this case, if you want to cater for that 1,771 watt hour, you're going to need 2 batteries. So that would give you 1,800 watt hour in this scenario. Now then, so coming back to this sheet, here I'm providing the example of my household and what I've done for my battery bank. I have a total of 8 lead crystal batteries. There are 2 series strings connected in parallel. And that again we'll talk about in another video in terms of how you'd configure a battery bank and the potential issues in terms of whether if you wire it correctly, drawing power out your batteries too quickly, connecting batteries in parallel to help reduce the load on each battery. There's a fair bit to consider in terms of just setting up a battery bank. But in this case, I've got a battery bank, 850 amp hour batteries at 12 volt. They are lead crystal. So that provides me with approximately 7,200 watt hours. And for me that's great because that means I get through my evening's consumption with something to spare. So if we do have a power outage right in the morning at my weakest point, I've still got some energy to ride us through part of the day until the sun comes out and starts charging things again. So that should give you a rough indication. But this is an exercise you need to go through yourself. You have to obviously, for this size system, it would obviously be able to charge these batteries. As you can see, our system can provide 8,200 watt hours. And that's including the losses going into the batteries, right? But obviously here, you need to cater for being able to have some power requirement or use during the day, and then putting energy back into your batteries. And there potentially is a whole nother science in terms of balancing what's important to you. Are you using more energy during the day? In which case you need a smaller battery bank. But obviously if you oversize your battery bank, if I had to double the size of batteries, but yet I've only got this size array, well then guess what? One full day of sunlight is not going to charge my battery bank. So those are the things to be wary of. Right, so I hope you found that exercise interesting. What I will do, I'm going to have a link down below to my forum, and on my forum I'll have a note of the kind of calculations and the losses you need to cater for. If there's enough demand, what I might do, I already have a spreadsheet that I've used in the past to calculate solar systems in terms of the array size, losses and the battery bank. If there's enough interest, I'll produce a generic one of those that could be used to help you. Please note, it is there just as a guide. I'm not a professional solar power installer at all. I do this for my own interest and I do the research, but if it's going to add value, I can certainly place it there. And again, if there are any of you who have queries about calculations and want help and assistance with that kind of thing, then please, I'd say, don't address me via email, address me on my forum, because then it means a whole lot of other people gain value in seeing that information as well. Going forward, as I said, the next video we'll start talking about specific components, i.e. like the solar panels. There's been one interesting comment which has come from a few people in terms of making DIY solar panels. Now, I personally would probably advise strongly against that. I'm going to cover that off in that video. If you realize the potential losses you have in even a cheap Chinese produced solar panel, in terms of the type of glass, the way it's put together, how well it's going to withstand the environmental conditions, you may want to think twice about producing your own solar panels, but we'll discuss that in a future video. Next is obviously understanding the issues you might have with wiring, selecting grid tie inverters, charge controllers. All of that I'll try and cover off with the kind of experience with the kit that I've had and what I've read on the internet. Then we'll also start looking into future technologies, better energy storage devices like using lithium iron phosphate or hybrid capacitors. Mentioning hybrid capacitors may sound far off, but believe it or not, even in laboratories at the moment, there are hybrid capacitor or capacitor technologies which are getting up to the storage capacity of lithium technologies. And therein lies potentially a bright future, because there's very low internal resistance, so you can put energy in very quickly with minimal loss, and you can draw it out quickly with minimal loss, and it will do many cycles. So we're going to talk about energy storage, what you need to take into account. If you invest a large amount of money in a big battery or bank, do you need to renew it in 5 years' time? Solar power technology, including micro inverters or efficiencies on solar panels, AC solar panels. There will be production of AC solar panels which become more plug and play, and you don't have to worry about all the other components. So in future videos, that's what we'll look into. I thank you very much for following this video series. If you do gain any value, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it on your Facebook, Google Plus or Twitter feeds. You can always support me on my Amazon store down below, or my sponsor tester.co.uk. You can go there and have a look at equipment that might be of use to you. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you soon for the next one. Cheers. Tester.co.uk